At one time, there were nearly 100 different languages spoken by various indigenous groups within the borders of present-day California. One of those languages, Serrano, became dormant in 2002 with the passing of Dorothy Ramon. Her first language was Serrano. Shortly before her passing, Dorothy worked with a linguist to publish a book of memoirs in both Serrano and English. Then in 2003, her nephew, Ernest Siva, opened the Dorothy Ramon Learning Center in Banning in order to continue her work of preserving and disseminating Serrano language, music, and culture. Despite there no longer being any fluent speakers, there are local revitalization efforts, including a full credit course teaching Serrano at Cal State San Bernardino. The San Manuel Band Serrano Language Revitalization Project started almost a decade ago, and it focuses on creating multimedia resources for Serrano education. Most recently, I happened to read an op-ed in the LA Times penned by Mark Araujo-Levinson, a resident of San Bernardino and student of Ernest Siva. That's again the nephew of Dorothy Ramon. Joining us now to talk about his experience is Mark Araujo-Levinson, Cal State San Bernardino student and language preservation specialist with the Morongo Cultural Heritage Department. Mark, thank you so much. We appreciate you joining us. Now, I understand you don't have necessarily a direct familial connection with any of the California tribes. Is that right?
Well, thank you so much for having me. And to answer your question, no, I actually don't have any personal California indigenous blood in me.
But obviously this is a real personal interest to you. And how did you get so interested in Serrano and preserving the language?
It started off with, actually, I was learning the Navajo language first because it's the most spoken Native American language in the United States. I was learning that for a couple of months, and then eventually I came to ask myself, how come I've never heard of indigenous California people in like public school and so on and so forth? And I came to learn of the Cahuilla, Luiseño, and Serrano languages. And, long story short, I met with Mr. Siva November of 2017 just to learn a couple of phrases. And that started off my journey in now going on 5 years of learning the language. And
do you like the language just intrinsically, the sound of it, the composition of the language? Does it appeal to you, or is this more about the preservation of the culture and language as a vital part of the culture?
For me, I really like this languages in general because it's always fascinating to me. But for Serrano in particular, it was just like an opportunity just to learn something really rare. Not that like as a preservation thing, but it was just like genuine curiosity. But as my relationship with Mr. Siva grew a little bit like a friendship and also learning the language actually became one of my favorites. And now like part of my job is to preserve it. But I always liked how it sounded and its history and things like that. It always fascinated me along the way.
You mentioned 3 indigenous groups, the Cahuilla, the Serrano, and I missed what the third one is that you mentioned for languages.
When I was looking, there was also the Luiseño language.
Luiseño, yeah. And are those languages, in your experience, similar at all because of the regional closeness of those tribes, or are they highly different?
Well, I think there's kind of like this running joke I hear. Between the Cahuilla and Luiseño, they're much closer, and the joke is that Serrano is out in left field. But there's some closeness in some aspects, but if you look at it like on face value, it might look really different.
Mm-hmm. All right, we're talking with Mark Araujo-Levinson, Cal State San Bernardino student and language preservation specialist with the Morongo Cultural Heritage Department. I really loved the op-ed he wrote for the LA Times about why he's made this commitment to learn Serrano. And the gentleman who's teaching the language to him is the co-founder of the Dorothy Ramon Learning Center in Banning, which focuses on preserving, teaching, and spreading awareness of Native American history and culture. Ernest Siva. Mr. Siva is also an elder and cultural historian with the Morongo Band of Mission Indians. Mr. Siva, thank you very much for being with us. How has this experience been for you teaching the language to Mark?
Oh, it was amazing because it didn't take very much, and he picked it up so fast, and everyone knows in our neck of the woods know how difficult it is to do that. And so he has a special talent for languages, and we're so glad and happy and a savior in sorts because he is doing fine work at the Morongo School, K through 8. And anytime he needs has a question, I'm always ready to answer it.
Did you grow up with the language?
Yes, it was spoken in my grandfather's household, in which two other speakers, my mother and sister, and I had a stepfather who spoke a related language, but they spoke English to each other, so I had English and Serrano.
You know, for so many indigenous families, with the Indian schools banning the speaking or writing of the indigenous languages and all the different economic and cultural pressures that indigenous Californians faced, how was it in your family that you were still using the language with all those pressures around?
Well, we had a law that was presented ages ago. Our great-grandfather, Francisco Morongo, was the one addressing young families and saying, learn this new way which was given to us by our younger brother, and you will succeed in life. But never forget where you came from and never forget your language. Otherwise, your tribe will be lost. You'll be wandering and wondering.
You know, some of the tribes that have done very well with casinos have set aside significant funds for educational centers to really teach about the culture and language of indigenous California. And what's your sense of how much progress that's made in educating California non-tribal members about this important history?
Well, I admire San Manuel. They are ready to. They have classes available for those who work there, who are non-tribal members, and they recognize interesting language and the fact that this is a place, if you want to learn, you can learn about the language and actually start speaking a little.
We're talking with Ernest Siva, elder and cultural historian with the Morongo Band of Mission Indians. He's also the co-founder of the Dorothy Ramon Learning Center in Banning, which focuses on Native American history and culture. And his student, Mark Araujo-Levinson, student at Cal State San Bernardino, joining us. He's a language preservation specialist with the Morongo Cultural Heritage Department. Mark, would you mind speaking just a line or two of Serrano, just so we get a sense for the rhythm of the sound of that language?
Yeah. And I said, I don't know what to say.
But you said it. That's great. Sometimes when my wife and I travel in the American Southwest, we listen to Navajo radio, and Danae, the language is just so rich. It has such a wonderful cadence. And I wonder for you if that's a part of this as well, the beauty of the language.
That's interesting that you bring that up, because when I was learning Navajo, my good friend whose first language was Navajo told me that, that's one important thing when you learn, especially these languages, is that there's a certain rhythm and cadence to it that he's able to tell a native speaker from a non-speaker because of that cadence. So he really kind of drilled that in my head. And when I was learning Serrano, it was the same thing, because, every speaker has their own way of speaking, and paying attention to the cadence and the rhythm of the language was something I try to pay close attention to, because, it can make a difference in trying to sound natural. Yeah.
Yeah, and there is its own artistry in that rhythm of language as well. Mark, are you seeing interest in younger people, teaching them the language and passing this on?
I think that's one of my main goals is, to put that interest and that spark for some of these students to want to be really good speakers. And I'm seeing them, the younger folks from, I think Mr. Siva brought up the preschool to 8th grade, and I'm seeing, interest in it. It's, as Mr. Siva said, it's a little difficult, but I'm trying to smooth the bridges and make it as easy as possible. That way it doesn't look as intimidating, and that way we can see much more progress.
I understand when you conversed with Mr. Siva, you're up to 70% of the conversation being in Serrano now. That's got to feel great to be able to do that.
Some days are good, some days are bad, but when, I'm on game and, I remember all the words I want to say, this is an amazing experience. And one thing that I kind of cherish is, when I'm feeling kind of, let's say I'm down some days and I want to ask him a question, I sometimes just kind of vent to him in Serrano, that it's more personal that way. And I'm, I cherish that, and I'm sure he does also.
All right, Mark, thank you for being with us. Mr. Siva, we thank you for being with us as well. I would think that this is affecting for you, and maybe you just share with us as we close how meaningful this is to you to have a young man like Mark be so committed to doing this.
Well, what the elders had passed down, and I stated it, and the weight is on our shoulders who are able to bring that about. And any way we can, it makes us happy when we have someone like Mark helping our students and elders as well, because adults are learning as well.
Thank you so much, Mr. Siva. That's Ernest Siva, elder and cultural historian with the Morongo Band of Mission Indians. Mark Araujo-Levinson, Cal State San Bernardino student and language preservation specialist with the Morongo Cultural Heritage Department. It's AirTalk on KPCC. Coming up, it's just you and me, but I want to hear from you very promptly about what your thought process was, what went into the decision when you got married as to whether you would take your spouse's last name, whether you would hyphenate, combining the two last names, or whether you would keep the last name that you had before marriage. We're at 866-893-KPCC. That's 866-893-5722. You know that J-Lo is now Jennifer Affleck. We'll hear what you think about the decision that you yourself made. 866-893-5722. Or email us at atcomments@kpcc.org. Please include your first name and your location. We'll be back in 90 seconds.